Chris Brannigan is a former advisor on defence policy to the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Very good evening to you.
Good evening, Tom.
The risk of sounding a bit like Carl Pilkington, tanks, do we need them?
Everything that you need within your military inventory is driven by what you want to use it for and what you think your enemy is going to use against you. And so I'm always inclined to suggest that if your enemies have tanks, it's probably a good idea to have something that can either defeat tanks or are tanks themselves.
You have some very, very senior former members of the military, indeed General Lord Dannatt, previously Chief of the General Staff, saying that the idea of mothballing these tanks now is, quotes, very dangerous, particularly when Russia is resurgent and has built up its own heavy armoured forces.
I think that the idea of mothballing any military equipment, carries a certain amount of risks that go with it. Military equipment is normally only as good as the people who use it. And really importantly, only as good as the people who are familiar with it. So I'd really want to sort of tear out, and General Dannatt's point is a very opposite one, because it points out the fact that, yes, you can take the equipment and put it to one side, but if people don't know how to use it or aren't, up to date and familiar on it, you can't just suddenly take these things out as if by magic from some storage facility and imagine that everyone's going to know how to use them the way they did when they went into storage.
Costs money, though, doesn't it? I mean, you look at some of the fleet of 227 Challenger 2 tanks, the 388 Warrior armoured fighting vehicles. These are going to cost multiple millions to upgrade.
Everything in the military inventory costs money. Everything comes down to, do you want to spend more money on fighter aircraft, or do you want to spend more on your independent nuclear deterrent? What quality of boots do you want to give to your, to your servicemen? Everything costs money. But if you're going to be a player, if you're really going to be part of an alliance, if you're really going to be able to form and turn up with the goods on a day when it counts, you've got to spend money.
Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, gave a speech a month or so ago now and said that the future, as he saw it, the future of the military might not be what's in front of you as you're looking out to your enemy, but actually what's above you. And as part of this massive review that you were involved in at the start, when you were working in Number 10 with Boris Johnson as his defence advisor, it seems to be that the way that war is conducted is changing so dramatically and so quickly that actually things like tanks might become obsolete. So what do you see as the sort of future of where Britain's military needs to be?
So I think the future where Britain's military needs to be is a place that allows us to cooperate with our allies, that allows us to meet whatever the contemporary threat might be, that allows us to be able to plan for a commitment and a reaction to the scenarios that are presented to us on the basis of the intelligence that we gather, on the basis of the world as we see it developing, and coupled with our foreign policy objectives. The important piece in all this, Tom, I think, is that if we are revisiting and revising what our place in the world is, and how we think that's going to go and fit in with other people, what does some of our hard power commitment to that look like? And in some cases, it may well look like increased investment in cybersecurity. It may look like cyber warfare. It may look like space.
Yeah.
Or it may look like, a couple of battle groups of armoured vehicles. Scenario is the thing that you ought to be able to plan through and think about what it is you want to make the commitment for. And if the scenario, based on our very capable reading of the situation and the environment that we think we might operate in on the battlefield, doesn't match the one that is immediately evident, nor does it match the one that we might nostalgically or romantically imagine it could be like in the days when we were very competent, then change it. But make sure that whatever we're presenting as that option, whatever we think that scenario is going to go and be, and whatever our foreign policy objectives are going to go and be, that all those things match up, because that's where you're going to make a commitment to spend.
Well, I wonder, and then I wonder to what extent you think perhaps when it comes to this particular story, the cart has been put before the horse here, because until you know what your objectives are, what your foreign policy is, what alliances you want to form and what you want them to do, you can't really know what equipment you need. So what is it that you think and that you were working on in the past as to what Britain's role in the world should be and how the military can play a part in that?
So that's certainly still an evolving project. There's still discussion that's going on within that. We're here in a position where you're working towards an ideal, and if you have an ideal in mind, if you think about what it is you want to be, you can then start to stress test. You can then start to test with your allies. You can then start to have that conversation. You can't plan that within an abstract or an academic vacuum. You can't imagine that's what you want, and therefore that's what will come about. The reality, the hard reality, kicks in that says, actually, you may think that the future fundamentally exists in really clever computing, and therefore how you're going to go deal with your cyber warfare. But you've got to be able to fight alongside your allies. We're not a nation who are going to be in a position where our foreign policy objectives might see us fighting independently, unilaterally in any of those environments. What are people going to go and do around us? What's our commitment expected to be? What are we expected as a P5 member going to be doing? We're a grown-up nation with a grown-up attitude and a grown-up approach to what we think our future can be determined. But you can't get grown-up credibility if you turn up and say, well, I'm sorry, I forgot to bring the thing I was supposed to bring with me.
And I wonder then to what extent Britain's it's such a big question, is it? What is Britain's role in the world, certainly post-Brexit, but even, God forbid, and not that she ever will leave us, but post-Elizabethan era. Do you think Britain is about to become more ruthless in that sense?
Oh, that's a great question. I think we have to be wholly more realistic, and therefore have to, consider. We have to have a clear-eyed and cold-eyed vision of what that future is going to look like. We can't take a sort of nostalgic view backward, as we mentioned a moment ago, as to how we imagine we're going to go and be. You can only fight with what you've got. And if what we've got, requires some difficult choices, then those difficult choices end up having to be made. I'd come back to that point on, that, we wouldn't be doing this alone. So, who we think we're going to be working with and who we think we might want to provide opposition against should be the determinants.
And just finally, I wonder what people will say. Look, this is all part of a kind of demoralising, de-escalation, kind of degrading of Britain's military, and that plays into a sense of Britain as a fading power, Britain as a lesser player on the world stage, and perhaps again into what you were describing earlier as that sort of nostalgic idea of what Britain is. I wonder to what extent you think that's true when you look at this story again of the mothballing of the tanks, but also the enormous budget black hole that exists in the Ministry of Defence. To what extent is Britain's armed forces being downgraded and depleted?
I think that you can look at any period of change within, in British military tradition, and you can look at the point at which we move from rifles to machine guns, from horses to tanks, from propeller-driven aircraft to jet aircraft. All those things are always difficult. They're normally forced upon us by, a defeat or a catastrophe, and it's normally blindingly obvious. There's no point charging against, enemy tanks if you're only equipped with lances. But what everyone wants to do, what all sides within the situation want to do, is think about what that strategic leap can be technologically that allows us to move forward. And I think Britain still has quite a prominent and realistic role to play in what those future leaps look like and how they are technology enabled. Can you
give me an example? Can you give us an example? What's one of the big technological leaps that you think Britain is best placed to help make?
So I think in the very broad field of what we do in cyber challenge and cyber prevention, we are still seen as global leaders. We still have technologies and approaches and imagination that create a degree, removes our vulnerability, ensures that we are moving forward, and other nations aspire to the same standard that we already set. They aspire to, work with us, and they recognise that we're a leading role within that. And we can go on and talk about any number of other areas that might come up. Space is an area where I think we've got huge imagination and potential that we could do something significantly greater in, with a broader recognising of space as a contested domain in the way that we contest the domain of land and sea and air. Space and cyberspace are the two areas where we're still looked at by other nations as a leader in each of those new challenges. And therefore they would aspire to be part and integrated of whatever it is that we're producing. It's difficult to say. You were back into foresight and forecasting and thinking about what we think that might look like. And my earlier point about scenario, whatever we imagine might happen, we should be prepared to make some commitment to that, ensuring that it's mitigated to the greatest extent.
Chris, great to talk to you. Chris Brannigan, former advisor on defence policy to Prime Minister Boris Johnson, now a senior fellow at the Policy Exchange think tank. Thank you for your time.